Dawn of the Infinite is the new Megadungeon coming to World of Warcraft in patch 10.1.5. It hosts a total of 8 bosses and can only be completed on Mythic difficulty currently, with the dungeon being split in half for Season 3 of Dragonflight, which I'll have guides for, so make sure to come back for those. The first boss you'll find is Chronikaar. She'll often cast Sand Stomp, forming withering sand pools under players that inflict heavy arcane damage and reduce players' haste by 25% and movement speed by 15%, so avoid standing in these. Chronikaar will target players and leap to their location one by one with Eon Shatter, inflicting massive damage to players in the targeted area and firing out Eon fragments, dealing damage to players struck and knocking them back. This leap will also spawn Eon residue inside the location that a player will have to soak, otherwise it will explode in a residue blast, dealing huge damage to all players and leaving a nasty dot on them. Tanks and healers will need to keep an eye out for Chrono Shear, knocking the tank away and causing a sheared timeline, increasing the target's damage taken by 600% for 1 minute. This debuff cannot be dispelled until the massive healing absorbed from the lifespan shear is healed through, so be prepared to save healing cooldowns for here. Rinse and repeat until you take out the boss. Moving on to the second boss, we have the manifested Timeways. Around this boss are fields of decaying and accelerating time that continuously tick around the boss in segments. Decaying time inflicts arcane damage to players every 3 seconds and reduces players' damage taken by 20%. Accelerating time inflicts arcane damage every 1 second and increases movement speed by 30%. The boss will apply Chrono Fader to players that inflicts more arcane damage to players for 30 seconds and needs dispelling. Once dispelled, it will release a ripple of bronze magic, dealing huge damage to players passing through it, so you'll need to run through it as quick as possible. Do note that this wave travels extraordinarily slow if the player dropping the puddle was affected by decaying time, so healers you'll want to wait until the player is positioned in these segments. Fragments of time will emit pockets of time which radiate outwards from the boss, inflicting damage upon impact and applying a dot for 6 seconds. This dot can stack, so avoid these at all costs. These pockets are also affected by decaying and accelerating time, so try and dodge them inside the decaying time pools. Tanks will want to watch out for the Timeways Unwind ability, inflicting arcane damage in a frontal cone twice. If the tank is afflicted with decaying time, the second tick is noticeably delayed, so tanks will want to position themselves in the darker triangles for this ability as well. As a tank, you'll also want to make sure you are always in melee range of the boss, otherwise it will start to cast Radiant, inflicting arcane damage that increases by 15% for each cast. After defeating the manifested Timeway, the next boss you'll face is the Blight of Galakrond. This boss is a 3-stage encounter, starting with an ooze that seeps toxic corruption on the ground through Blight Seep, draining the creature's energy. Occasionally, the Blight will afflict players with corrosion, causing a corrosive expulsion that deals damage to anyone within 3 yards of their impact and stunning them. Corrosion will inflict nature damage and reduce the afflicted target's haste by 5%. This debuff stacks every 3 seconds until the player reaches 10 stacks and gets mind controlled. To remove this debuff, you'll want to pass it to your tank ready for Blight Reclamation. The Blight shoots out a frontal cone, inflicting big physical damage and pulling the tank in, also reclaiming the corrosion, removing the affliction from your tank. After taking enough damage, the Blight then transfers to a new host. Anzon becomes active and has access to all of Blight's abilities, but will also cast Necrotic Winds, pulling players into the Blight seat while sending out volleys of tornadoes. These tornadoes knock players back and inflict nature damage if struck, so be sure to avoid them. The final phase spawns Lozkaleth and Dazak, which share a health pool via Essence connection. Again, they gain access to the previous abilities, but Loz will root a player with Necrofrost, reducing their haste by 20% until the ice is destroyed around them, so players will want to hard swap and burst this down. Dazak channels a frontal incinerating Blight Breath, so dodge this, but do note that it also damages the Necrofrost. He also casts Blight Spit, dealing damage to random players. Next we move on to the infamous Iridikron. The first thing to know with this fight is defeating Iridikron is not the goal of this fight, instead we must break his concentration so that our partner Chromie can attack. During the fight, Iridikron is trying to kill Chromie, so we must protect her as she protects us. The boss will target a player with Extinction Blast, one-shotting anyone within the impact zone unless you are under Chromie's timeline protection. This bubble reduces incoming damage to players by 97%, but will exhaust Chromie after the channel ends. To overcome her exhaustion, players must protect her from Stonecracker Barrage. This attack follows Extinction Blast and fires barrages of stone at Chromie for 2 seconds. This damage is split amongst Chromie and any players hit, so you'll all want to be inside the targeted zone. Tanks will need to position themselves in the front swirly to prevent the rest of the group and Chromie from being afflicted with Stonecrack. dealing big damage every 1 second for 15 seconds, and this affects stacks. Tanks, do make sure that you run back into the first zone after the first barrage pushes you back. Iridikron will shield himself with Earth Surge. While the shield holds, he pulses out AoE damage to your group every 6 seconds, and these waves also increase the damage of the next wave by 25%, and this stacks, so the aim of the game is to take out the shield as soon as possible. While channeling, he will also be sending out erupting pillars that you'll need to dodge that also deal large damage and knock players back if struck. After destroying the shield, Iridikron will slam his wings down with pulverizing exhalation, dealing heavy nature damage to anybody caught in the huge frontal or circle under him. At this time, his wing slam also causes pulverizing creations to spawn under players. These creations will spam cast Stonebolt, inflicting a bleed on players, so stack them up, CC them, and burst them down. During the fight, the boss overwhelms the tank with Crushing Onslaught, increasing the physical damage taken by the player by 75% for 3 seconds, and this does stack. Tanks will need to be wary of this debuff getting too high. Finally, at 100 confidence, Iridikron unleashes a Cataclysmic Obliteration. Here, he will concentrate on finishing his cast to unleash a one-shot to the party. But if players reduce his energy to 0 before the cast finishes through damage, his energy backfires and staggers him. And to help with this, Chromie casts Timeline Transcendence, allowing players to see their future potential, increasing our damage, haste, cooldown recovery, and resource regeneration massively so that we can stop Iridikron. After scaring off Iridikron, we'll fly with Chromie to the next boss tier, the Infinite Keeper. Tanks will have to deal with the boss's Titanic Blow, dealing huge physical damage in a frontal cone and leaving consecrated ground on the floor that deals fatal ticking damage, so make sure to avoid this and tanks don't fill up the room. Tyr will also face random players and hit them with Infinite Annihilation, exactly the same as a tank frontal but dealing less damage and again leaving some consecrated ground. The boss will also cast Dividing Strike, dealing huge arcane damage divided among players struck within the targeted area, and if less than 2 players are struck, the boss will gain Infinite Empowerment, increasing all his damage done by 33% for the rest of the fight, and this affects stacks. Here you want your whole party to stand within this soak. Tyr will inflict 2 players with Spark of Tyr, dealing arcane damage every 2 seconds to players within 4 yards. Healers need to dispel this, but beware that upon removal it will deal party-wide damage, so don't get too hasty with the dispels. Finally, at 0 energy, Tyr will siphon Oathstone, gaining a Radiant Barrier and causing a hastening eruption. While the Radiant Barrier holds, it inflicts AoE damage every 2 seconds, so players will need to burst down this shield ASAP. During the hastening eruption, volleys of Time Essence can be collected to increase haste and movement speed by 15%, stacking up to 3 times to help you delete the shield. However, time capsules that reach the Oathstone will add to Tyr's Radiant Barrier, so make sure to intercept these before they reach the middle. Upon defeating Tyr, you'll have to navigate the gauntlet and avoid getting hit by any of the frontals or swirlies, otherwise you'll have to restart. Now we can choose what boss we encounter next. For the sake of this guide, we'll be dealing with the Time Lost battlefield. Here the fight will change depending on your faction. This is a relatively simple fight with not too many mechanics, but if you are Horde, Anduin will cast Mortal Strike on your tank, reducing the player's healing received by 50%. He'll also aim a frontal shockwave at the tank regularly, so other players should be sure to dodge this. Outside of this, Anduin will summon 3 adds whenever he casts for the Alliance. Your group should swap to these adds and cleave them down ASAP to continue on with the fight. These adds are CCable, so help to reduce the outgoing damage here by kicking and stunning. Note that healers can dispel the fireball dot that conjurers apply too. Anduin will pursue a random player with Bladestorm, so your party should make sure to stay away from him during this cast as he travels around the battlefield. And finally, he will cast Battle Cry, dealing AoE nature damage to your party, so be prepared with defensives if needed. The fight is pretty much the same for the Alliance players, except for obvious reasons, you'll now be fighting the Horde. Grommash will also cast Bladestorm on a random player. Dodge this whenever he is channeling it. Again, he applies Mortal Wounds, reducing the tank's healing received by 50%, but he applies this through Decapitate. Grommash's version of Shockwave is named Death Wish, unleashing multiple strikes in a frontal cone at the tank. He will also deal AoE damage to your group through Warcry, dealing nature damage to all enemies. Similarly to Anduin, he will summon 3 adds through for the Horde, cleave these down ASAP, and healers dispel the Immolate that the Warlocks apply. And finally, every time Grommash loses 10% health, he will gain a stacking 5% damage buff through Rage. Now we move on to the alternate form of Chromie, Morchie. She fires a tank blast in a frontal cone, so make sure to face her away from the group and DPS spread out. Outside of this, she'll cast more problems, summoning clones of herself that channel a Dragon's Breath. Before her clones finish casting this spell, they will destabilize, leaving only the real Morchie to unleash a wide cone attack, so you'll need to find her quick here and position yourself behind her so you don't receive a Sam Buffet debuff. This applies a dot to players, dealing ticking damage every 1 second. Morchie is the only one not wearing a hat, so quickly scour the room and then hide behind her. Morchie also creates traps at random locations with time traps. Triggering these traps will cause a time stasis, rooting players for 30 seconds or trapping creatures until the next familiar face is cast. This cast summons copies of your party that fixate on the corresponding player, which you'll need to drag through a time trap, otherwise it will probably kill you. Rinse and repeat this fight until you take her out. The last boss in Dawn of the Infinite you may have seen before, Chrono-Lord Deios. This is a two-phase encounter where the main aim is to take out the adds as soon as possible in phase 1. These infinite timekeepers will create portals that summon reinforcements that we must take out. Apart from this, they'll spam cast Infinite Bolt, dealing arcane damage to a random player, and they'll also apply a dispellable magic dot in Chronal Burn, dealing damage to a player for 15 seconds, but this decreases in frequency over time. Upon defeating these timekeepers, the Rift destabilizes, inflicting 15% max health damage to Deios over 4 seconds. Take out these timekeepers as quickly as you can so that you're not overwhelmed when more spawn, as at the same time you'll be dealing with Deios, who will conjure infinity orbs which fall to the ground and upon arrival will explode in an infinity nova, dealing huge damage to players and increasing their damage taken from future novas by 300% for 3 seconds, and this does stack. Do note that these orbs will fall slower when players are stood underneath them, so if you do need to stagger the debuff, then just assign players to stand underneath them. Deios will cast a frontal breath on tanks, inflicting arcane damage and slowing their haste and movement speed by 20%. This effect does stack but also affects enemy units, so tanks should try and aim these at the summoned adds too. Upon defeating all of the keepers, the boss will now enter stage 2 at 20% health. Here, Deios has 3 abilities that he will repeatedly cast until the end of the fight. Infinite Corruption is the new one that blasts Nozdormu with bronze magic, sending arcane artillery throughout the arena, so make sure to dodge these swirlies, and these will scar the ground for 2 minutes, dealing nature damage to players stood within it. Try not to fill up the room here. He summons even more infinity orbs that you can stagger by standing underneath them to better deal with the infinity nova debuff. And finally, Deios continues to cast his temporal breath frontal attack, and during this phase, Nozdormu is freed and we also receive a haste buff, so this stage of the fight is actually pretty free. But that's all you need to know for the bosses inside the Dawn of the Infinite Megadungeon, so that wraps up this guide. If you did enjoy this guide, then please drop a like down below and also subscribe to your boy, and until next time, I'll catch you guys later.